Hello, Internet. My name is Matt Welch. I'm the editor-in-chief of Reason magazine, your magazine for free minds and free markets and scary people with knives. And I'm joined today and happy to be joined by senior editor Jason Zengerle of the New Republic. Jason, how the hell are you?
I'm good, Matt. How are you?
I'm doing as good as can expect. I'm going to apologize to you and everybody else in advance. We're having an event here in the Washington office. Are you in Washington, by the way?
No, I'm actually in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, where the only event is rain today.
Yeah, there's some of that here too. We're having a screening of we have a bunch of 3D videos that we're introducing this week to go with our 3D issue on how to slash the government before it slashes you. And anyways, there's a bunch of ruckus and inappropriate props and other kinds of things lying around, and people will be going behind me. But anyways, enough about me. You wrote a very interesting profile of Dr. Congressman, except he's not a congressman, Rand Paul, in the current issue of GQ, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, the October issue, so I think that's the one that's still on the shelves.
And I'd like to get into that, but first, just can you give us an idea of what interested you in the topic of Rand Paul?
Just the fact that he's such an outsider. I mean, so many politicians this year are trying to run as outsiders and cast themselves as as such. And I think in Paul's case, I mean, he genuinely is. The guy is he's just not a politician. I mean, he is an ophthalmologist to his core. He's a reader and he's a doctor, and I don't think he's spent a lot of time. It's certainly not in the electoral arena of politics. I mean, obviously because of his father, he's very interested in politics, but he has a real intellectual interest in it, and he's not a joiner, and he's not a clubby guy, and he just, in so many ways, he's just really kind of bizarre, and a lot of those ways are actually refreshing. I mean, I don't necessarily agree with him on a lot of stuff, but he's very fun to cover because he's not someone who sticks to his talking points. He's bound to say something interesting in any sort of stump speech. I mean, he's obviously being a lot more careful now than he was in the past, but he's almost sort of constitutionally incapable of sticking to a script, and he's sort of an interesting character. He's such an oddball that he's a lot of fun to try to write about, try to cover.
We did a profile of him, I think, in last May, that kind of talked about how, on one hand, he's the most significant sort of manifestation of the Tea Party movement in the country because he had a non-trivial shot of becoming, the first Tea Party-ish senator, and then sort of his dance between dealing with kind of a traditional Republican or conservative politics and more kind of politics of his father, which are hardcore libertarian, and the way that he was kind of juggling that in the big tent that he was dealing with. A very interesting part of your article is what happens after his primary fight, because during his primary fight, Mitch McConnell, who is a non-insignificant member of the modern Republican establishment, tried to croak him and brought out the desiccated husks of Dick Cheney and the kind of neocon establishment.
Rudy Giuliani, I think, yeah.
And they lost in a huge way. And then, so your article talks about how then Rand Paul, made his peace or started to interact with these people. Talk about that. What did you find?
Well, I think that he has a very difficult balancing act because obviously so much of his appeal, as you saw in the primary, was that he was not McConnell's choice. He was someone who Dick Cheney didn't like. He had this real kind of insurgent flavor, and I think that went a long way towards him winning. I mean, I think a lot of people in Kentucky almost cast their vote as much against McConnell as they did for Paul. But then as soon as he won the nomination, he obviously had to try to make amends with these people. I mean, he was in a much stronger position, obviously now being the nominee, and he could dictate the terms a little bit more. But at the same time, he does need to reassure some of these Washington Republicans and some of the more sort of prominent members of the Kentucky Republican establishment that he's not going to be a flaming radical if he gets to Washington. And he's really been trying to kind of quietly, tell them in private meetings and the like, especially in foreign policy. I mean, it's interesting. In Kentucky, I don't think, in the actual race that's going on, I don't think foreign policy is an issue at all. I don't think that's anything that voters care about. But when you talk to Republicans in Washington, that's something that they're really, really concerned about with Paul, because I think they're really afraid that he's going to be like his father when it comes to foreign policy, and I think he's really going out of his way to try to reassure Republicans privately that he's not his dad. I mean, he's obviously in his public statements, tried to distance himself from his father on, stuff with Iranian nukes and things like that, 9/11. Just he's tried to put a little distance to himself, but those things aren't coming up a lot, obviously, in the campaign trail. So these efforts on his part, I think, are happening more privately. I mean, I found out about this one meeting that he had when he was in Washington. He went to meet he sought out this meeting, which is actually kind of interesting, with Dan Senor and Bill Kristol and a couple other neocons, where it sounds as if he basically agreed to take a tutorial from them on foreign policy and sort of understand what their concerns were with him, and they kind of explained to him why they were worried about Iranian nukes and things like that. And he sat and took it, which, if you followed him at all, he doesn't seem like the kind of person who goes into listening mode very easily. He seems much more like someone who's willing to offer his opinion than actually listen to yours. And I thought that was very interesting that, according to Senor's account of this meeting, Paul was there to learn. I think he said he was in absorption mode. He also went to APAC and had a meeting with them. And as I understand it from someone familiar with the meeting, he basically said, "I'm not my father," and was really trying to reassure the APAC people that he was someone who could be trusted. I assume that's because he's worried that there could be some money put into the race to help his Democratic opponent.
I think I could speak on behalf of all patriotic Americans when I say that whenever Bill Kristol is giving a tutorial on foreign policy to a politician, we should all reach for
good things will happen.
Our wallet, our gun, and our passports, or something like that. No, it's interesting to watch. I edited a Libertarian magazine, obviously, and libertarians love to disagree with each other even more than they love to wear top hats and eat orphans. And the engagement with Rand Paul has been contentious from the beginning because there's a lot of, especially the anti-war focused libertarians are very big fans of Ron Paul and saw Rand making a lot of "I'm not my father" type of statements on foreign policy, especially. And so, you describing an APAC meeting and a debriefing from Bill Kristol, I think, sealed the deal for at least a minority slice of libertarians out there. And it's interesting to me. I follow the neocon establishment with some interest, having written a book about John McCain, and it is stunning to me the resilience of especially Kristol and the kind of Weekly Standard right. I mean, they went from showing audibly and visibly revulsion at the idea of the Tea Parties and a lot of this movement, and Ron Paul especially, and a lot of other elements of this kind of populist uprising that we've seen in the last 3 years on the right. And they've gone from there to being, the biggest Tea Party enthusiasts, debriefing their candidates and making sure that no matter what else happens, that they're going to be out in front of that one too. And it's remarkable because, national greatness conservatism, especially, or sort of David Brooksian conservatism, is big government conservatism. And if there is a through line with the Tea Party people or movement, there's a lot of different, sometimes inchoate strands of that movement. But if you look at what they always talk about, it is the size and the sort of acceleration of government. And Rand Paul is certainly an expressance of that. He wants to talk about that government has gotten too big, it's going too crazy, and he wants to hack down parts of it. And you have this movement that is as responsible intellectually as any other out there for creating what David Brooks memorably called in 2004 the death of small government conservatism, now being in charge. That's just I don't know if my hat is off. It's just kind of remarkable to watch.
Do you think that Paul, as a libertarian, what do you think he's going to be like in the Senate? Assuming he wins.
What do senators do? I think that the Senate, after after November 2nd is going to be in pretty much obstruction mode, if Republicans get hold of it, which I think is a toss-up at this point. And even if they get close to a majority, they're just going to be trying to stop the Obama. We're going to have gridlock. So I think he will be an enthusiastic participant of gridlock. And in that mode, from my point of view, more power to him. That sounds great. I don't think that he will be the type of person, and I don't know this, I'm just guessing. I don't think that he's going to be, calling for a series of kind of witch hunty investigations of the administration, the kind of stuff that we saw in the 90s under Clinton. I don't think he's been hitting those notes particularly strong.
Yeah, that's definitely not something. I mean, I guess I'm wondering sort of what kind of headaches he would cause for the Republicans in the Senate. I mean, obviously at a certain level they'll all be in agreement about just obstructing Obama, but when it comes to earmarks, when it comes to defense spending, I mean, is he going to do you see him sort of staying true to his his libertarian principles and calling McConnell out when he tries to get certain earmarks for Kentucky and the like?
There will be less calling McConnell out. I'm pretty sure. I mean, I haven't been following his campaign blow by blow, but I watched his response to the Ground Zero mosque controversy, for example, and it was pretty stunning. I mean, he had his campaign manager say that this is not a Kentucky issue, this is not a federal government issue. He said that on Monday, and by Tuesday afternoon, I think Rand Paul was saying, they really ought to build that thing elsewhere. So, I mean, he's playing politics, and he had a piece in the USA Today, which actually was pretty interesting kind of discussion and defense of his political philosophy, which is pretty strongly libertarian. But the headline was something like, "Why I'm not a libertarian."
Why I'm not a libertarian.
He's trying to kind of half distance himself. So it's unclear what he will actually do. But I think it's obvious that he would want to do whatever he can to repeal Obamacare, or whatever foot dragging is going to happen with the healthcare reform bill. He will be part of that. He will be part of leading that, and to whatever extent Republicans can snip or encourage the snipping the size of government. The thing is, they're not doing that. I mean, I don't know if you read the pledge, and I hope to God that you didn't. But this is the business.
I have to confess, I have not read.
This is the business that we're in, sadly. But we had a piece that I recommend people read by Jacob Sullum talking about it. It's garbage. I mean, for an attempt to kind of co-opt and channel the Tea Party sort of anger or strong enthusiasm for limiting the size of government, they have zero examples almost of what they would do. There's nothing but agriculture subsidies. They don't touch entitlements, and at some point, you got to touch entitlements. They certainly don't talk about defense. So that's the GOP that's going to win. The question is, are the Tea Party-ish insurgents going to be able to move them, create a caucus that has some juice? I don't know. The gears of government grind kind of slowly. I think that the GOP is underestimating the extent to which them advertising their future sellout is going to be a winning idea.
Yeah, I mean, I think that'll be the really interesting thing with Paul. I mean, I think some of these other candidates were sort of, flying the Tea Party banner. I mean, Sharon Engel's pretty nutty, but I mean, she seems a little bit more opportunistic. But I mean, I get the sense with Paul, he really believes this stuff, and he's not a conformist. I mean, this idea that okay, he's going to get to Washington, he'll be senatized, sort of the power of the institution will bring him along. I mean, there's nothing in his history, his personal history, because he doesn't really have much of a political history, that suggests he's that kind of guy. I mean, the whole, Aqua Buddha thing, which kind of got blown out of proportion. I mean, what I thought was so interesting about that anecdote was, it showed he was sort of bucking the institution when he was at college. I mean, to do that at Baylor, that's about as sort of, transgressive a thing you can do.
Baylor's a big religious school, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's Baptist. I think the way to sort of, tick off the administration there is to do something sacrilegious, so that's what he did. I think that was probably worse than, any kind of drug use. And then, when he was an ophthalmologist, he founded this Renegade ophthalmology organization. I mean, the guy has a history of kind of like, pissing off people in power, not really caring about it, sort of going out of his way. So, I think Republican caucus meetings will become a lot more interesting.
Yeah, and he ran, really strongly against that establishment, as your article makes clear, and he beat it by 23 percentage points, which is just a rout. And so, you're not going to lose muscle memory of how it is that you won, and that's how he won. I find the Aqua Buddha story interesting in how it didn't matter at all, and we see this a lot. We see it with Christine O'Donnell too. It's easy with these people. It started off with Rand Paul because he was the most obvious and notorious of this new breed of politician, and luckily, I think for him, there's been a lot of people who are considerably more wacky than he seems, and you can even put wacky in scare quotes to a certain extent. But Christine O'Donnell is against masturbation. What the hell is that? And there's been sort of an understandable, or at least predictable kind of media, reaction against the nuttiness of these people. But I think what they've done is ignore what they're running on. It's not like Christine O'Donnell is running on masturbation. And I think what voters, and this is not just Tea Party voters, these people are getting votes in primaries and will get votes in general elections. When voters are telling candidates, and then by extension the party, that, look, for the last 10 years minimum, you can say 15, but definitely in the Bush-Obama era, the limited government tendency has disappeared in two-party politics on the federal level. There's no question about that. You have a lot of these people will say, yeah, I feel guilty. I didn't protest under Bush, or I didn't do as much as I wanted to, but, they are legitimately pissed off about TARP and identify Bush with that. That tendency has not been touched or respected, and a lot of the economic crisis, if you go by that kind of a worldview, seems to be exacerbating the problem, the public policy responses to it. So what they're saying to these candidates is, you can be a lot weirder than the norm. You can have a bizarre skeleton in your closet. We are willing to forget that if you are willing to take our message here, which is pretty monomaniacally on this thing. So there's going to be a lot more leeway for unpolished weirdos right now if those people can be seen as convincing on this other point. And I think it's very difficult for even the mainstream Republican Party to internalize that message right now, and it's fascinating to watch.
Well, do you think that the sort of the unpolished weirdo quality of these people actually gives them more credibility in terms of their concern about fiscal policy and the like? In some ways, those two things dovetail, and it actually reinforces their standing in the eyes of Tea Party people.
Certainly, I think within Tea Party and probably broader right, and I guess we find out in November if that translates into the general audience. There is, without a doubt, a sense of kind of cultural victimhood that's with that. Sarah Palin, who is not precisely a Tea Party figure, she's actually pretty controversial if you look at polling data about people. A lot of people really like her, and a lot of people really dislike her. But she kind of personifies that cultural victimhood of the fancy pants elitists looking down their nose at us normal mama grizzlies out here, and certainly you saw it with Christine O'Donnell, that people rallied around her because she was attacked so hard, and it's the kind of dynamic where the more you would say, you could just make up some crazy shit about Christine O'Donnell right now. She had sex with a bear, on the Potomac, and people will say, hot
real
damn,
Mama Grizzly.
that's... Sorry, I got Mama Grizzly on the brain, obviously, but and people will say, liberal media, trying to do gotcha journalism again. So yeah, there is going to be some cultural reinforcement, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays. That's obviously not my cup of tea when it comes to that political tendency, and unfortunately, American politics are a lot about cultural grievances and kind of that kind of tribalism. And we have right now a intense dislike on both sides, for both sides of the aisle, and that I think that cannot be emphasized enough. And my lodestar in this is the California special election in May 2009, which a lot of people have forgotten about. But the entire political class, the governor, every newspaper except for the Orange County Register, said you have to pass this package of reforms, no matter what. We know that the budget is screwed. You're tired of misgovernance, blah blah blah. But look. All that aside, the serious adults need to come together and pass these kind of rubber band, stringy, sort of patchwork jury-rigged reforms. That's the only way that we're going to save the state from Armageddon. So the entire establishment supported it. They outspent the opposition 7-1. It was just a rout, and they lost that package by an average of 30 percentage points. 30 in California. You can't get a 30 percentage point spread on anything in California. You can't get it on the Beach Boys in California. But if there's an opportunity for Americans to show and vent their disgust at both parties right now, they are going to take that. So yeah, being a weirdo outsider is kind of helpful. The question is, how weird is it going to be before people distance themselves? I think that, O'Donnell will probably lose.
Yeah, I think she might be the breaking point there.
But it also depends on the political makeup of the state and whatnot. But I think we could segue into Matt Taibbi's piece in the Rolling Stone. I'm eager to hear what you read about. I'm no great fan of Taibbi. I think he's probably the most overrated magazine journalist in America. You always find out about what he thinks about something. I mean, he wrote a piece that sort of mirrors yours. It talks a lot about Rand Paul and the Tea Party movement, and his intellectual conclusion is that I figured out the Tea Party, and here's the deal: they're full of shit. It's interesting, just as a window into the mindset of the Matt Taibbis of the world, and that's kind of always of some value. But I think there's a broad kind of misunderstanding of Tea Party people there, or there's people don't want to go to the lengths that it takes to understand what that's about. They want to look at little bits, and he does a fair amount of reporting in there, and it's not without value. But I think that it's so difficult for a lot of people to understand them that they choose at some point to put their hands up in the air, recoil in horror, and I don't think that's really going to help either the case of good journalism or broader the kind of case of both political discourse and democratic success. If you are going to run against the Tea Party right now, you're going to lose, I think. What did you think about the Taibbi piece?
Yeah, I think I had some of the same qualms that you did. It's kind of easy to go to these events and just, mock people and, their motorized scooters. It's low-hanging fruit. I thought his conclusions about the Tea Party seemed like a little stale and not particularly surprising. I mean, sure, they can be hypocritical, and they weren't complaining about this stuff when Bush was in office, and I think that's a very fair point. But at this point, it's not a particularly new one or any kind of revelation. I thought one thing that was kind of interesting with this story, just about Paul, was like this sort of conclusion that Paul's already sold out, which I just I don't think Mitch McConnell's people feel that way. I don't think people in Washington feel that way, and that was kind of an interesting take.
I think that it's people are. He overstated the degree to which Rand was wrong from the get-go. I mean, Rand has. There was distance between the two. The moment that he started campaigning.
Yeah,
even when
there had to be.
Hopeless, because he's different. He's a different guy. I mean, Ron is a one of a kind in many ways, and it's understandable that you would have differences of opinion with him. I certainly, for Christ's sakes, have differences of opinion with him. So it creates an easy narrative that it's a straight sellout play. But he does bring up a bunch of points. I think was it his or your article saying that Rand went from being against agricultural subsidies to saying only to dead farmers now.
That was. I mean, not to get too into the weeds on this, but I thought that was interesting in his piece because when I was in Kentucky, I went to this, and I ended up not writing about it in the GQ article, but I went to this agriculture forum. I think the Kentucky Farm Bureau had a candidate forum with Conway and Paul, and it was basically Paul going into the lion's den, and he held his ground. I mean, he said, we got to cut back on ag subsidies, and he had said before, he talked about some stuff going to dead farmers, but he didn't exactly kowtow to them on the subsidy issue. I mean, he tried to make a play on on abortion and cultural values and things like that. But I mean, and maybe at this point he kind of has to stick to his guns on that, because if he really did back down the way Tybee said he did, I mean, he would just be flayed for being a hypocrite. But he hasn't backed down as much as Tybee said, and I came away from that. And whereas Conway basically was saying, I'm just going to write you guys a check. It was just sort of a really kind of nice example of kind of a conventional politician and an unconventional one. And I came away from that event, somewhat admiring of Paul for sticking to it. I don't think he's backed down as much on that as Tybee said he has. I think he's been fairly consistent on that.
Yeah, we can use that as a jumping off point to talk about perhaps even the president. I was watching. Did you follow the Ken Burns baseball?
I'm not a baseball fan.
You're a college football. What's your deal?
Basketball.
College basketball.
Yeah, I like college football too.
And we have an intern here who admires you a little bit too strongly. I won't name him. So your deal is that you think they should be paid. You want to liberate the college athlete.
I do think, I think the slavery analogies are a little bit much, but I think at this point those guys should get some money. Yeah.
Is there any I think so too. Is there any actual movement that do more than 5 people in this country think so?
Yeah, no, I think there is a little bit of a movement. I mean, I think it'll have to come through the courts in some ways. There's kind of an interesting lawsuit going on right now. It's actually a class action suit by former players against the NCAA, and it's all over sort of royalties for their likenesses being used in DVD sales and video games and stuff like that, jersey sales, things like that. They want money sort of after they've graduated, but I think if this lawsuit were to, if they were to win this, that would fundamentally change the nature of college sports, and I think you would probably see some kind of introduction of some sort of payment, or at least, the establishment of some fund that these guys can draw from later, something along those lines, but
that's interesting.
Giving them some money.
Where is
right now the whole thing's just kind of set up for abuse.
Where is that lawsuit currently?
It's in the Ninth Circuit. I think it's going to be heard next, I think it's scheduled for next May. It's going to be heard by the same judge who did the Prop 9 case.
Although isn't he retiring, or am I confusing him with somebody else?
I don't know. Maybe I don't know. I thought he was hearing this case as well.
It could be hitting my news from Twitter. But anyways,
and Ken Burns.
I was watching Ken Burns, who I can proudly say. My best moment as a baseball fan this year came at National Stadium when he was introduced to do a ceremonial first pitch, and I stood up very drunkenly and just booed the hell out of him.
What do you have against him? You think he's going to tweet?
I love baseball way too much. It's almost like I shouldn't talk about it in public because it's disgusting. But I at the same time, I absolutely despise baseball nostalgia. I would like, to me, the worst movie ever made in the history of mankind, and there's really no argument about this, is Field of Dreams.
I knew you were going to say that. Yeah.
I actually watched a clip of that the other day to put a link, to James Earl Jones' speech about baseball.
Baseball, right?
It is just such garbage. I mean, it's the sport has always been filled with layabouts, drunkards, cheaters, and that's part, and terrible people, racists, all that kind of stuff. And it's also been filled with the people who are, great athletes and maybe noble in their own way. Like, there's enough on the factual basis of it that to wrap it up in this sort of timeless Americana and fathers and sons, and I'm just weeping up and I can hear the banjo playing, really just irritates the hell out of me. And so I don't like that aspect of Ken Burns.
Who do you think who gets baseball right in terms of writing about it, or films, or what's the?
That's an interesting question.
Do you like Bull Durham?
I actually did like Bull Durham much more than I expected to. I hate baseball movies that show really crappy baseball, which is 95% of them. It's like watching Bruce Springsteen pitch in the Glory Days video. You just want to wince and run away. And very few things get the kind of like ribald ground level reality of the sport. I'm a huge fan of Bill James's writing about baseball. He doesn't really talk about the physical play of it too much, except in his historical works. Roger Angel, I think, is a great baseball.
See, that's what I was kind of wondering, because it seems like Angel's sort of more in the Ken Burns mold now.
No, because he doesn't truck in this kind of endless, we're still sad over the Brooklyn Dodgers moving west, and there's so many writers and intellectuals who had their hearts broken that day, and little Doris Kearns Goodwin is still crying. I mean, this whole bullshit. He doesn't go there. He just sort of talks about, in an intelligent way, how the game is played and discussed and this kind of stuff. And that's a qualitative difference than this sort of slow motion panning and, Joe DiMaggio, this noble, wonderful giant of a man and all this kind of stuff. I'm much more of a ball four type of guy.
Sure.
Give me what it actually looks like and feels like, and celebrate that and love it warts and all more than this grand mythology kind of crap. But anyways, this is all really about deregulation.
Of course. It always is with you.
Yeah, pretty much. I spent earlier this week interviewing the sort of founding CEO or founding-ish CEO of Southwest Airlines, Herb Kelleher. They just had a big merger today, and we were talking about deregulation. People think of, it's fascinating to me how it has just become a go-to term of derision for people. Like, it's like AIDS. Remember when AIDS happened? Remember when deregulation happened? And I asked him about that. Southwest did not fly an airplane for 4 years after its inception because they had to sue everybody, not sue everybody, but withstand lawsuits and fight for the right just to get a plane in the air all the way up to the Supreme Court because of regulation and because of cartelized, government-managed competition to an extent that people, any younger than I am, can't believe that it actually, happened. You had to apply for permission from the government to fly a route, and you had to prove that you wouldn't be taking market share from somebody, and they would set the price of the ticket and the lunch that they served. It was incredible. We talked a little bit about why is it that this process, in terms of airlines, that made it from a situation where 15% of Americans had flown to 85 to 90% of Americans have flown, has become this term of opprobrium, if that's a word. And in the Ken Burns documentary, it came up, they were talking about steroids. That was the big sub-theme of the 10th inning. And there's just the one-liner of, and because of deregulation, that's why Mark McGuire used Andro. That's why it was on the shelves. And I did, an hour's worth of Googling, and it's just not true. It's not remotely true, Anabolic steroids started to become regulated in 1990 on the federal level and on the state level, and Andro was only introduced in the 90s, and it was specifically outlawed by regulation by the FDA and by another amendment to the Act. And it's just interesting to me, the kind of, and Obama does this every day, and this is why it's sort of relevant to talk about from the stupid baseball documentary. Obama says every day at this point as he's campaigning, the Republicans, they governed for 8 years on the philosophy of not funding education and deregulation, and that's what got us into this mess. And it's infuriating, as you can imagine, from a magazine that prefers limited government, but also prefers journalism, to have to wade through this on a daily basis because it's not true. It's just not true. Bush was not a small government president. He was a huge government president. He was a big regulator. He started more significant regulations than any president since Nixon. He hired 100,000 regulators. He's increased spending by more than anybody in a really long time. And it strikes me as it's maddening in a way, and obviously I'm turning purple and monopolizing the conversation.
No, that's fine, please. You seem to have opinions about this.
No, it's the whole thing of being entitled to your own facts. It's this: people can safely comfort themselves in the knowledge that they don't believe in the big bad deregulation that has afflicted this country in the last 10 years, but it hasn't. That hasn't been the world that we're living in, and it's odd to me that the President of the United States is campaigning on something which is kind of provably false.
I mean, you don't think he's just using a shorthand, though, in some ways?
He is, but it's a shorthand for what? I mean, if you're going to, and he's done it since he's been president. I mean, if he's going to get into the weeds of deregulation, specific financial deregulation, he's got to deal with Sarbanes-Oxley, which was a regulation, which happened under Bush. Glass-Steagall, which I think he dislikes, happened under Clinton.
Sure.
And it's a shorthand. I think people make fundamental mistakes, and they do it on the right and in libertarian circles all the time, and it drives me nuts there too, of just getting the opposition wrong. It's like the people who think Obama's a secret Muslim. It's like Dinesh D'Souza, who's just
that's a bit of an interesting,
a freaking idiot. But know your enemy. Know what and know what has happened and what hasn't happened in terms of them being able to enact their agenda. And they're fighting against an enemy that didn't exist, at least over the last 10 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't quite know if sort of what is it? Kenyan anti-colonialism is quite equal to deregulation in terms of maybe in your world, but I don't think it has quite the same impact. I'm not sure if people hear that and have quite the same.
No, but I mean it is interesting to me, just like what is. Does the word glow in a kind of a radioactive way when you hear it in your ears? Does deregulation equal?
Yeah, I mean, no, it does. It's an effective. I mean, I think it's an effective shorthand for. You want to sum up the Bush years. You want to sum up what the mess Obama inherited. It's a relatively pithy way of doing it. I mean, it does.
It's not true. It's not true. That's kind of a problem. I mean, you can a tax cut and spend perfectly short.
That would be better. Yeah, that would be a little bit more true.
Totally accurate, right? And it's interesting. It's like people.
You want to try to capture the Wall Street madness, though. I mean, it's a nice catch-all. Tax cut and spend doesn't quite get the kind of culture up that was going on Wall Street and things like that. I mean, I can see the political reasons for putting it this way.
Yeah, it's always curious to me, and maybe there is some. In a way, like it's an ongoing reaction against Ronald Reagan. People are still traumatized about Ronald Reagan. He sounded and talked like a deregulator, and he was to some degree. And so, since that is a kind of foundational memory, and certainly conservatives worship at the cult of Reagan, or the altar of Reagan, to a degree that's just stunning to watch for a native Californian like myself. It's the same way that every Democratic president has to run, or has to fight the ghost of Jimmy Carter in some way, even though Bill Clinton really had nothing in common with Jimmy Carter besides putting him on airplanes and sending him to kind of diplomatic missions now and then. But somehow, I'm now just riffing badly out loud, but there is the, let's say, kind of DNA of these shorthand myths that still are there. I mean, actually, when Obama is running against deregulation, he's not running against Bush. He's running against Rand Paul, right? He's running against the manifestation of this long dormant strain. And in the same way, the Republicans, when they ran against Obama, called him, he's going to be a big government disaster and all this kind of stuff. And actually, I at the time, to my discredit, found that hard to believe because he was campaigning on a daily basis to enact a net spending cut, and he did this even in the financial crisis. And so they were making Carter or McGovern analogies constantly, but maybe they, in their sort of inaccuracy, identified a long dormant strain. And my God, take the conversation away from me because this virus is.
Well, I think it was funny you were talking about Reagan and sort of Obama trying to tap into some sort of anti-Reagan sentiment. I mean, because he gets a lot of grief from the left for kind of speaking of Reagan in less than negative terms in terms of his kind of being a transformational president and the like. I think there would be a lot of people on the left who wouldn't necessarily put him in the camp of someone trying to run against the ghost of Reagan. But I mean, maybe that is where sort of the deregulatory kind of glowing word, as you said.
Yeah, I mean, I think he does actually, as you say, name check Reagan as someone to look for in terms of his political impact. And
Yeah, I mean, just sort of, just kind of modeling the political sort of impact that people
And they both wear a
but,
suit pretty well, you know?
It's true, they both wear a suit. I mean, did Obama ever announce football games or anything like that?
I don't know, actually.
Lifeguard?
But what's your take on his whole, the disaffected Democratic base? You sent me a link this morning about donors sitting out, these wars with the professional left and all of this stuff. It strikes to me as an outsider-ish, looking in on that as a real circular firing squad situation.
Yeah.
I mean, you shouldn't be running your midterm elections against Jane Hampshire and Glenn Greenwald, as far as I can tell.
Yeah. I read some article the other day where it was sort of, I think it might have been a Politico, it was kind of an in and out, who the White House is okay with. They're okay with, like, Olbermann and Maddow, but, like, they're really pissed at, Glenn Greenwald and, I don't know, one of the Fire Dog Lake bloggers, and it was, I don't know, just kind of having, like, I think someone called it, like, a frenemies list seemed a little ridiculous, the amount of time and attention they're giving this stuff. I don't think it's a really, particularly successful base rallying strategy to bitch about the base and tell them to, stop whining. I thought these rallies he did, the rally in Wisconsin, I mean, I think that's, you can kind of roll your eyes about it, and he definitely sounded a little bit more, I guess, desperate in some ways than he certainly sounded during the campaign. But I think that's the way to go at this point before the midterm. I mean, they have to do. Look, I mean, you need to somehow try to make up the enthusiasm gap that exists, and you're not gonna do it by telling loyal Democrats and liberal Democrats to get over themselves. So you might as well try to recapture some of that magic from 2008. I mean, I really hope like will.i.am doesn't come back, but that would not be a good thing. That might convince me to stay home. But I think it seems like they sort of settled on the right way to do this. It'll be interesting to see if he does more of those rallies, but maybe hitting every college town in America. Maybe he'll come to Chapel Hill and just do some rallies at these places, and at least turn out that segment of the electorate. Just even if you just get a few more of them to come out, that could help in some ways. And I think you're more likely to do that by having Ben Harper, whoever, play than you are to kind of whine about Glenn Greenwald.
Our former editor of Reason, Virginia Postrel, wrote about Obama, I think for us, but maybe on her website, Deep Glamour, talking about his glamour problem, which is that this is sort of, talking about the 2008 campaign. He's this glamorous figure on which you can project sort of unspecific hope to. He had the first couple of incredibly attractive family. On his good days, when he's hitting his rhetorical stride and just sort of embodying Americanness, he seems unbeatable. You want to believe in him. I really wanted to believe in him on some level as much as I can physically believe in an American president. And so you project these hopes, but when you have this kind of non-specific set of ideals, and also and campaign promises that get broken, the opportunity for disillusionment is especially sharp.
Just the reality of the presidency at this point, just the reality of governing. I mean, did you read Noam Shiver's Axelrod profile on TNR?
I don't think so. Was this part of the whole "this country can't be governed" meme that's going around? Yeah,
and I think you can disagree with that if you want, but I thought there was a really interesting sort of point he had about Axelrod himself, and basically Axelrod's whole history as a consultant was sort of a history of falling in love and then becoming disillusioned, and his disillusionment would always come after the candidate he fell in love with and worked on the campaign got into office and ultimately sort of fell short of being the reformer and the true kind of true reformer that Axelrod thought he would be. But in a way, Axelrod's own history of never going into government kind of allowed him to do that. He would get one of these guys elected, they would get in there, he'd fall out of love with them, and then he'd just go on to the next candidate and sort of put all his hopes in that candidate. And what's so hard for him right now, and I think what's so hard probably for a lot of Obama's supporters is they went along with him into. I mean, Axelrod literally went along with him to the White House, but I think a lot of Obama's supporters did, mentally, and just they really, it's just been a really disillusioning time for them, sort of seeing this guy they thought could do everything kind of, run up against the realities of government. You can say whether it's governable or not, but it is obviously harder to do than when you're in a campaign, and I think that's some of what, and that's a lot of what people are experiencing. Is just this guy who seemingly could do everything, and was sort of this manifestation of hope. It's like that doesn't really cut it when it comes to getting stuff through the Senate, and it's I personally feel that to a certain extent, and I consider myself fairly cynical.
We get a lot of kids, staying kids coming through the office.
This for the 3D?
Just in general, we have people coming through student organizations and whatever, and inevitably I always ask them, and they could be totally libertarian, and I say, so why did you vote for Obama? Because they all voted for Obama for the most part. And none of them say, because I really wanted him to use TARP money to bail out auto parts manufacturers, or I really wanted to make sure that the stimulus program had a lot of weatherizing in it. It usually has something to do with, I hate Republicans' policy on pot and drugs in general. I hate Republicans being anti-immigrant. I hate Republicans being anti-gay. I hate Republicans being pro-torture, pro-Gitmo, and maybe a couple of other, and pro-war, and that's about it. And those exact areas are the ways in which he has been most disappointing to the Jane Hampshire, Glenn Greenwald left, and I don't think that they have the White House in their, I think, ham-handed sort of combat with these people have ever really engaged that. Like, you said you'd close Gitmo, you didn't. Obama laughed off suggestions about pot being legal anywhere. I mean, at an online forum, is saying, I guess that shows you what the kids are doing online. Yaff, yaff, yaff. That's not fun.
But it's not like during the campaign he was, flying like a marijuana leaf on his. I mean, it's not. That was a lot of projection.
Well, sure, but I mean, I think it's interesting, and maybe he doesn't really understand how people's political tribalism works in sort of the mirror image, right? You join this because you hate those guys. And when people realize that he's really not a hell of a lot better, I think I remember when Sarah Palin during the campaign, one of her good lines was like, basically, I have the same position on gay marriage as Barack Obama does, and Joe Biden does, and that kind of thing. And people were stunned that it's in fact true. So, like, those people are ripe for the picking right now, and I think it makes it pretty interesting to see the effects of specifically Prop 19 in California, which I've been writing a lot about and following. Jane Hampshire she has this Just Say Now campaign of legalizing and supporting legalization movements all over the country, and her thesis is that this is the only, or one of the strongest ways to actually reactivate the lost Democratic base. It's young Democratic voters who are really into legalization, and if you get that on the ballot, then they will go out and vote, and they will end up voting more Democratic than Republican. And I think it's actually borne a little bit of fruit in California. California, I think, Jerry Brown and the other undead Democrats who are trying to win election in November are still holding water against Republicans in an incredibly dissatisfied state. And part of the reason why, I think, is because Prop 19 is on the ballot and people are looking to vote for it. And it's an interesting dynamic, I think, going forward.
But then what happens? So let's say Brown wins. I mean, and then doesn't sort of start choking up in the governor's mansion. Like what? What's the?
Well, I mean, I think
what's the fallout?
It's interesting to me that the head of the anti-Prop 19 campaign is Dianne Feinstein. Brown, Whitman, Fiorina, Boxer, everybody. Schwarzenegger is dead set against it. I've been tracking the editorials at California newspapers. I used to work at the LA Times on there as an assistant editorial page editor, and so far. 16 of the top 25 papers have editorialized on it, all 16 against. I mean, I haven't seen such establishmentarian, consensus since May 2009 when they got their asses handed to them. So that's pretty fascinating. I don't think that, those Democratic voters aren't going to vote for Jerry Brown because they think he's any good at anything. They're just going to vote for him because they're more Democratic than they are Republican, and so they're not going to put their hopes there. But the Hampshire sort of analysis is that, look, Democrats, this issue is actually a winner for you. Maybe you should stop being such a gutless bastard on marijuana reform, which is totally popular, especially within the Democratic base, but Democratic politicians won't touch it because they still are living in this, sort of land where they don't want to be seen as weak on crime and drugs.
How long do you think it'll be until someone actually has the guts to do it?
I am right now willing to bet that Californians will pass Prop 19. It's up 7-10 percentage points in the polls, which isn't very much because these things kind of break negative usually towards the finish line. But the recent, I think, field poll in California trended in the right direction for voting this. It's going to happen at the ballot box in a state. They're going to have some legalization measures in a couple of states in 2012, as far as I think Western, Mountain West kind of areas. One state is going to challenge the federal government sooner rather than later on this, and it's going to be, from my point of view, awesome. It's going to put, the Atlantic had some piece like trying to unpack the Obama administration's nightmare of what happens if Prop 19 passes, because he's got all of his ex-DEA drug czar people on record saying you need to sue California just like you sued Arizona on the immigration bill on this. He's had Kurakowski, writing op-eds in the LA Times saying this is a terrible idea. There's open question to see what the federal government would do in terms of raiding marijuana dispensaries, which they've continued to do under Obama, even though they kind of said that they wouldn't. And it's going to put this open conflict. But from my point of view, the greatest part of it is that same thing with when California legalized medical marijuana in 1996. It shows people that it can be done and the sky doesn't fall, I mean, there's where I grew up in the aerospace belt of Long Beach, California, which was a very culturally conservative, patriotic place. And down the street from my dad's house, there's like a couple of pot leaves in windows, and he's rolling with it. The sky doesn't fall. People use this shit, including at every editorial board, and certainly all the political magazines in Washington D.C. I can testify. And
you've been to these meetings?
I've heard of these meetings through the grapevine. No, it's a nonsensical position, but it's fascinating to watch things that are so entrenched, and people are frightened to be the first one to break. And it's one reason why I'm interested in the outside candidacy in 2012 for Gary Johnson, who's clearly interested in running for president and like trying to be the Ron Paul of 2012 or soaking up some of that enthusiasm.
How does Ron Paul feel about that?
It's unclear. It's unclear right now whether Ron Paul's going to run. He has been friendly with Gary Johnson in the past. I think he has said something like, "If I don't run, I would hope that my supporters would support Gary Johnson." I don't know to what extent I know Gary Johnson a little bit. I've talked to him during the run-up. I last saw him at the marijuana convention in Portland, Oregon, and so I don't know to what extent that they're talking or coordinating or anything like that. But certainly there is space open on the Republican side of the aisle right now for someone who is going to be semi-radical on limiting spending, at least to the degree of a Paul Ryan type character, and also who might touch some of this enthusiasm from across the aisle on legalization, which is it's a winning position to have in a lot of states and among a lot of different constituencies. And as someone who doesn't like either party, I'm always really glad to see their minds get blown when a Republican is pro legalization. And I would I can't wait till this becomes part of national politics in a way that it hasn't been and has long since deserved to be.
I mean, do you think it'll sort of follow the same trajectory as gay marriage?
it'll go less quick, I think, just because there's so many built-in incentives on the drug war. I don't know if you follow the work of Bradley Balco for us.
Yeah.
I can't believe that he gets up in the morning because every day it's another outrage about the drug war, and the shows like The Wire, showed the kind of perverse incentives. You get all this gear and SWAT team crap from the federal government, ex-military crap. If you say that you're going to use it to do SWAT raids to execute, marijuana search warrants. The prison guards union in California and a lot of other places are very, very powerful constituencies, district attorneys, and all these kinds of things. Plus, there's the political angle of the sort of new Democrat tendency, of which I think half of which was a welcome from my point of view, the economic half, but the other half, which was personified by horrible people like Gray Davis, was that we are going to out-execute people from the Republican Party, and we will be harder on drugs, and we'll be harder on this kind of stuff. Clinton and Gore were terrible on that, and Gray Davis is terrible, and that is, I think, encoded in people's memory. We've gotten to the.
Well, in Kentucky, that's like the one sort of read of hope that the Democrat has. He's trying to paint Paul as soft on drugs.
Isn't that great?
He's running as real law and order.
Are there any prominent Democratic politicians, to your knowledge, who think that marijuana should be legalized? Maybe Barney Frank has said something.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm trying to think what Sinich has said about that. He would seem to be the logical candidate, but no one is certainly planning too high a flag on that.
Yeah.
It's not
but going back to what I said about young voters and Obama. People vote for people not necessarily because of their stated agendas, but because they embody the opposition to these things that they hate. Democrats have left this issue on the table since Jimmy Carter came close to kind of decontrolling marijuana in the 70s and then didn't follow through. So for 30 years. And I think you're going to see a lot of sort of social issues, gay marriage kind of being one of them, that those issues are going to leave. You're not going to be able to count on that Democratic vote just because the Republicans are worse on it. When the Democrats have power and don't do anything with it on these issues, that's part of the enthusiasm gap. And I don't think that Obama understands that.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think he's allowed almost too much projection in some ways. Certainly on gay marriage. He was quite happy that he could sort of say he was opposed to it, but people thought he really was for it, and that they're sort of finding out now that's not the case, and I think that's disillusioning for a lot of people.
Give me we're running into the end of our time, and I've talked too much. Give me a couple of minute case of why one should be enthusiastic about Obama, or at least why one should resist the Republican tide that's going to definitely sweep up in November.
I hate to make it frame it entirely negatively, but
that's what happens sometimes.
He's better than the other guys. I think as someone who supports Obama, I think it's really unfair to sell short healthcare reform, to sell short the financial stuff. He's had significant accomplishments, and just from if the Republicans take back both houses, especially the House, it's just going to be, and from your perspective, I guess 2 years of gridlock is good, but just 2 years of subpoenas and needless investigations, it's just it's a serious point in the country's history, and to sort of squander this time on frivolous crap that I think it's just depressing. It did feel like we were kind of an inflection point 2 years ago, and now we're sort of back in the same old crap, and I am framing it fairly negatively, but that's kind of the way I feel at this point. It's hard to be entirely positive and enthusiastic just because the threat that's on the horizon, from my point of view, it seems so dark that you kind of have to focus on that. And maybe it's projecting and saying he's not the other guys, but in some ways I think that's probably the best case that could be made for him.
I will give you a reason to be optimistic for the Democratic Party, which is that after November, Republicans are going to have more power, and they're going to be in front of cameras more, and they're going to be more influential, and we are going to judge them on how they act and behave and legislate.
Yeah, no, I agree with all that, but I mean, and I think, I think in a weird way that Obama's, re-election chances are probably improved if the Republicans, do what it looks like they're going to do. But the fact that we're going to have to suffer through 2 years to get there, to me, is not particularly encouraging. Yeah, I mean, there's a certain schadenfreude or something, just having to see like Boehner and Mitch McConnell kind of, actually, take responsibility for what they're doing, but at the same time, like, I think the consequences of that are not anything to look forward to.
Yeah, the other potentially interesting thing for me is just how fast the pendulum is swinging at this point. I think it's a real sign that both parties continue to leak kind of market share in the hearts and minds of Americans. They want to vote the bums out every 2 years at this point. And a lot of people look on that in despair. I see that as a great opportunity, or a wisening up that we don't accept duopolies very kindly in the rest of the culture. Why are we accepting it in politics? On that note, let's break. Thank you, Jason. This has been very fun.
Thank you, Matt.
Let's do it again. And next time you're in Washington, come by the office and wear your 3D glasses.
If you have 3D, I will definitely come by.
Okay, great. Thanks.
All right, thanks a lot. Bye.